Hello, and welcome back to the Performance Marketing Unlocked podcast. I'm your host, Joseph Arthur, multimedia editor at Performance Marketing World. And first up, let me just quickly address the elephant in the recording, that being the sound of my voice. Unfortunately, I coach a social sports team out here in London. We had a big match on the weekend and I was doing a fair bit of hooting and hollering, and my vocal cords have paid the price. Nonetheless, we persist because we have some big news to talk about on this episode of the show. I'm sure every listener can guess what that is. It is, of course, Google's decision to scrap its deprecation of third-party cookies on Chrome in favor of a, in quotes, user choice alternative that is, for now, exactly as vague as that sentence was then. We know literally no more than that about it at the time of recording. Now, this is enormous news. It sent shockwaves throughout the industry, and there's been a litany of coverage across trade press, even some national media, and it's got everybody talking, including us here at Performance Marketing World. So to open the show, I'm joined by my editorial colleagues, Jyoti Rambhai, our premium content editor, and Reem Makari, our news reporter, to discuss our sort of instant reactions and quick little hot takes to the news, primarily centered around who the biggest winners and who the biggest losers are from Google's decision. Following that discussion with Jyoti and Reem, I had the pleasure of having a chat with Mike Fantis, the Vice President and Managing Partner of DAC Group UK. Now, Mike is an industry veteran and a real expert on data, and he knows exactly what this decision when it comes to third-party cookies means, both in the short term and the long term. And we had a really in-depth discussion about why this decision may have occurred with Google, what the user choice option might mean, and importantly, and perhaps most critically, what this means for the state of the industry going forward. Should we still be investing in first-party data, or can we afford to rest on our laurels and enjoy the fruits of third-party cookies labour? So look forward to that discussion with Mike right after this quick chat between myself and my editorial colleagues. Enjoy. Jyoti Rambhai and Reem Makari, thanks very much for joining me in studio today. How are you both doing?
Well, I'm doing well. Thank you for having us back. It's nice to be back.
Yeah, not too bad, thanks. It's been a busy week, actually.
Busy
news week as well.
It's been a busy news month, if we're being completely honest. There's been plenty to talk about, but there's obviously the one big headline news that's been dominating industry chatter for the last week or so. Google keeping third-party cookies around in their Chrome browser, at least for the foreseeable future, and instead of their much maligned deprecation that had been delayed, most recently because of issues to do with the CMA and competition, fears surrounding competition with the launch of the Google Privacy Sandbox. It seems the whole thing's been shelved in favour of a user choice option, which we'll sort of postulate on. But yeah, does anyone have any ideas what that might be, Reem?
Well, I think it's giving users more of a choice of what kind of cookies they accept and which ones they don't, if I have that correctly.
Yeah, well, I mean, you might have it correctly. To be honest, I don't think anyone really knows. There's a whole lot of clarity around exactly what that's going to mean.
It's very vague. It's very vague. And I'm a little bit, I would say, I think that's just the wording they've used for now, because they actually don't know what's going to happen. And I think that shouldn't change anything right now. People should just assume that we are eventually not, whether cookies disappears or not, we are eventually going to stop relying on them. Mm-hmm. So that shouldn't change what the people are doing and what advertisers are doing.
That by way of pushing for first-party data.
Yeah, exactly. I think especially if you look at the way consumers are behaving, consumers want privacy. They want to know what's happening with the data they share. And, you know, even with third-party cookies, I think there's a lot of education that either we need to have so consumers know what happens to their data, or they're just not they're gonna reject cookies, and we're gonna just see a move towards first-party data.
I think the fact that users might be given more of a choice on which cookies they're going to accept and which ones they're not going to, I think it's going to be more confusing for consumers, because there was a report that I covered recently that was talking about how much of a significant percentage of internet users don't actually know what cookies are and are actually very misinformed about cookies. And I think their concern right now is privacy, like you were saying, like that's their biggest concern. And if it gets more confusing for them, what's going to happen is they might just choose the option to reject all instead of actually looking at how it's going to benefit them and why they should accept cookies.
I mean, cookies themselves are so confusing because specifically the cookies that we're referring to, and this whole sort of story surrounding Google has been referring to, it's only third-party cookies in Chrome's browser. So it seems like you're sort of operating within the minutiae, but it just happens to be the dominant place where consumers go to. You know, most people use Chrome.
Yeah, so I think from a global perspective, I think Chrome has something like 65% of the market share.
That mark,
so it's huge.
70%. Yeah. So it's a massive amount, and third-party cookies, as we've been covering in the last 2 years at this point and beyond, I think our editor Robin would even tell you it's 3 or 4 years, but third-party cookies have been the most popular. But what I wanted to talk about, because we've got Mike Fantis from DAC Group joining the show later on, and we're going to dive a little bit deeper into exactly how this has occurred, why Google may have chose to scrap it, and what these new sort of this user choice might mean. But I thought editorially amongst ourselves, we could dive into just our early reactions, our early takes, and chat a little bit about who we think the biggest winners are from this move and who we think the biggest losers are from this move. So who would like to kick us off with maybe their biggest winner from the Google deprecation news?
Let me start, because having a chat with Reem before we recorded this, I think we can have a chat about what I'm going to say in a bit. But so for me, the way I've interpreted this is, I think who's going to benefit the most from the cookies remaining. And I think that's going to be small businesses and startups, especially those businesses that are just starting out or don't have the funds or the resources to allocate to collecting first-party data. And I think it's a short-term strategy for them, using cookies as a way of maybe having some sort of semblance for a target audience. And it's a way to maybe move towards collecting first-party data. So I think they're probably, to me, are the winners in this situation.
See, I don't necessarily disagree with you, because I do see your point, and I do agree that this is going to benefit them in terms of like giving them some more time to get their resources together to be able to invest in getting first-party data and kind of moving away from third-party cookies. But I've put the smaller companies as my losers in this situation, and that's referring to the ones that are really heavily cheering this news and thinking that they've just gotten an easy way out, because it means that they don't have to be investing their budget into those cookieless solutions, into getting their own first-party data, and thinking that they're just moving forward, they're just going to continue relying on third-party cookies from Google. And I think that in the long run is not going to work for them. I don't think that's a sustainable strategy, because not only is it better to just be conscious in case Google does decide to then scrap cookies again in the future, but it also, having first-party data is going to help them create those like personalized experiences for their consumers. It's going to help them connect with them more. It's going to be very beneficial to have that as part of their files, as part of the information they have on their consumers. And if they think that they can get away with just relying on third-party cookies, I think they're going to end up hurting themselves in the future.
No, actually, I do agree with you. And just to sort of add to that, actually, what you were saying earlier about people not actually understanding what cookies are, and maybe I think there's also maybe a bit of fear-mongering around consumers. So I think a lot of people are now just maybe going to say reject all. Mm-hmm. So those businesses that are thinking, oh, I'm just going to rely on third-party cookies, I'm not going to invest. Well, actually, if people are rejecting cookies, then there's not a lot of data there. So what the data isn't really, it's going to be probably skewed or biased. So it's not actually going to help them either in the long run.
I think both of you have got reasonable points there, to be honest. And I think those really sort of small scale businesses that perhaps are just trying to gain a little bit of market share, they might not be able to afford, to be super concerned with collecting their own first party data, and they've just got to sort of get data however they can. Maybe they're in that early startup phase where it's, month to month, just trying to get a foothold in whatever industry they're operating within. So I can see both of the points, but it's certainly short-term strategy versus long-term. And anyone celebrating this news and is happy with the fact that they've got a little bit more time to hold on to third-party cookies, and that's not all small businesses or new businesses, that will be a lot of big and old businesses too, but anyone who's more orientated around their short-term at the moment may be coming out of the current financial situation. A lot of businesses might be struggling, and this is a big short-term win to keep them afloat. I can see why there would be some cause for celebration. But as Reem said, when you look further down the line, particularly with the economy appearing to be entering a period of a bit of an uptick, they'll have to shift pretty quickly towards a more long-term solution, and it appears that first-party data is the way to go on that front.
I also think if you're a business that has up until this point not yet invested in any sort of solutions to gain like first-party data, or to kind of just like make you survive against Google scrapping cookies, you have to remember that Google's decision to postpone it till 2025 only happened a few months ago. It was supposed to happen in 2024. So if you were to have gotten to this point and not have had anything, you're way behind compared to the wider market. You need to look at what competitors are doing, and you need to see how you can give yourself advantages, because being this delayed in the process is really going to hurt you. The
ultimate reality of this, I think, and why there's been a lot of controversy in terms of the industry response to this news is, I think it's more, there's a pretty large pool of the industry that sit within that bucket of just hadn't done anything to prepare for a cookieless world, because maybe many thought that it wasn't going to happen, maybe thought they were always going to have time to invest elsewhere, maybe it just wasn't a big priority. And ultimately, anyone who sat within that sort of thought, that thinking bubble, has been more or less proven right up to this point. Is a lot of people said you just can't get rid of the cookie. It's going to be too much of an upheaval for the industry. Not enough of the industry is going to be prepared. It's going to cause a monopoly in terms of the sandbox and alternative solutions. And well, here we are. The CMA and Google clearly couldn't come to some sort of agreement that works, and the sandbox in its current state doesn't appear fit for purpose. So I fear that it is a bigger pool of the industry than we think who are just relying on third-party cookies and really weren't in the process of doing anything about it.
Do you think there's an element to that maybe people were aware and they were still relying on third-party cookies, but rather than not doing anything, it was maybe there wasn't a solution that they could find that worked for them? And maybe that's kind of the point there. There's a lot of stuff out there. It's not just the privacy sandbox that can help advertisers and brands, but maybe it wasn't something that they could find that worked for them. And I know there's an element, sometimes you maybe have to tech stack, there might be a few things, but I think there's an element of...
I think you're right, and I think there's a case to be made that there was just not... it wasn't a priority for enough businesses to go into a sort of test and learn approach when it comes to looking at alternatives. But to counter that, I know alone there was an op-ed on the website a couple of weeks ago. There was 25 alternatives to cookies, and which one's the best one? And there are 25 alternatives. I mean, marketing mix modeling has had this sort of resurgence in the last 6 to 12 months, all because of this idea of third-party cookie deprecation. And it goes to my biggest winners from this, I believe, is anyone offering an alternative solution to cookies. So I think the Trade Desk, for example, with their EUID2, which has been launched in Europe, I think they'd be licking their lips at this news, because as far as they're concerned, whatever competition the sandbox was going to offer, that's been negated for now. So I think these alternatives, because people are going to invest, and I think the way forward is first-party data and a privacy-centric approach. So I think these alternative solutions will be quite happy, really.
I had the trade desk on my winners as well, and I also had LiveRamp as well because they had the authenticated traffic solution. And it's like you said, like the ones that are very prepared, the ones that have had time to develop these solutions, they're the winners in this because they already know what they're doing. They already are prepared for any sort of future.
Now, before we round out, sorry to interrupt you, Jyoti, I'm just conscious of time here before we cut to our interview with Mike. There was one big loser that for me stood out, and that was the consumer. Now, not everyone will agree on this because there'll be a lot of consumers that may be a bit more shrewd and they know that they can manipulate third-party cookies based off their search to sort of get, I'm interested in this, so let me put the search out there and get whatever ads come my way. Some people have begun to do that, but I think, again, to your point, Jyoti, there's a big lack of understanding when it comes to cookies, particularly among consumers. And Reem's report that went out the other day sort of showed that, particularly that was to do with Americans. But I think across the globe, there's a general lack of understanding. So I just wanted to get your takes on what you think this news means for the consumers, particularly when it comes to user privacy.
So I actually had a consumer down as one of the losers. And actually, I was going to cite one of your articles that you did yesterday. The UK publishers, so Mail Online, Independent, Express and The Mirror, they've introduced this pay and consent or consent model. So either you pay and reject cookies and submit some form of data to them, or if you want to consume their content for free, then you've got to accept their cookies. So you're almost giving users an ultimatum. And they don't really get much choice then. And then that bodes a question of what these publishers are doing. Is it ethical? Because I don't think giving consumers an ultimatum is.
I know the practice is, I believe, been disallowed in Germany and Austria.
Yeah,
Does
so
that sound right?
First tried a couple of
It was
years
deemed
ago.
unlawful.
But for now, those publishers are perfectly within their right to do that. And third-party cookies, say what you will about the technology, it has proven to be very valuable in the past for organisations when it comes to their tracking.
I think that, like with publishers, I think it's a wider discussion of why publishers are doing that and why. It's because so that they can get their revenue. It's because so that they can get their money. And if people are rejecting cookies, then they're not going to be able to offer them targeted advertising, and they're not going to be able to get that revenue. I think there's a lot of, in terms of the consumer, I think there's a lot of kind of misinformation around cookies being a harmful thing and cookies invading people's privacy, and there's no need for cookies. And I think that consumers forget that what cookies get you when you accept them is that you are getting that personalized advertising.
Well, that's only if it's first-party data. Personalization from third-party cookies is incredibly poor.
Yeah.
That's the whole issue with the cookie technology, particularly when it comes to, and this is why we've got to make those inferences between first and third-party data, because third-party data is often it's hardly targeted at all. They just put you down to your IP and can sort of spam you with things. They just have your information on deck.
But when you look at the consumer, though, do you think that they would know the difference between if they're signing up for third-party data or they're signing up for
No, but I think
party?
a consumer will know the difference between good, targeted, personalised advertising and poorly personalised advertising. They may not consciously know it, but subconsciously they'll know it because they'll respond to advertising that is personalised to them and does help build a bit of a brand relationship, whereas if it is advertising that, like we saw recently, 90% of users think they get too much advertising on social media. So advertising, it can really annoy people when it is poorly targeted and it feels intrusive or invasive. So if you're going to hit them using third-party cookies in channels like WhatsApp or SMS or email and you're in people's inbox, it better be personalized and it better be useful. Otherwise, you're just going to destroy whatever brand trust that might have been there. And I think that's the greatest commodity, is brand trust, because it's very, very hard to gain but very easy to lose. And I think a lot of people underestimate just how harmful third-party cookies can be on that front. Unless we've got anything else to add, both, we might have to round out the discussion there and move on to our discussion with Mike Fantis of DAC Group.
That's fine. I think we could probably go on about this and debate this all day. So, yeah, that's probably a good place to...
Certainly, I think a good place to conclude. Thank you both for joining me in studio today. And, yeah, I think as journalists who have been covering this, as you say, Jyoti, we could talk about this all day and we can postulate and we can get into the weeds of it all, but ultimately we've got to turn to the experts at some point. That's certainly not the three of us. So please enjoy the upcoming discussion with Mike Fantis from DAC Group. Thanks both for joining me.
Great. Thanks, Joe.
Thank you.
Mike Fantis, thanks very much for coming down to Twickenham today to join me in the Performance Marketing Unlocked podcast studio. How are you doing?
I'm very well. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. We were saying off air, it's your first podcast. Our previous guest, Jodie Clayton from Major Players, was her first podcast as well. So we've had a couple of debutantes in a row. It's exciting stuff.
Nice. Yeah, no, looking forward to it. I mean, we do a lot of speaking at events, but yeah, first time on a podcast. Go easy on me.
Always. I will apologise quickly to the listeners. For those of you who listen to the show every fortnight, you'll hear that I sound a little bit hoarse than I normally do. I'm blaming that on I coach an Australian rules football team here in London, and we had a big match on the weekend, and there was lots of yelling and screaming and hooting and hollering, and we're recording this early in the week and my voice hasn't quite recovered, but do bear with me because we had to record this pretty quick smart because there was some massive news that happened earlier in towards the end of July, there being Google's announcement that they are no longer going to deprecate third-party cookies on their Chrome browser, at the very least not in the fashion that they'd otherwise outlined. And Mike, you had plenty of thoughts on this, I imagine.
Yeah, I mean, it's something that doesn't go away, does it? Keeps popping back up. But yeah, this news is very interesting for us. I think from a skeptical perspective, I would say follow the money. And is that the reason why the privacy sandbox maybe hasn't quite done the trick for Google? I've seen a lot of stats, Criteo mentioning revenue loss, Google's own test saying it's revenue down compared to the cookie environment that we're in. So I would say probably from a cynical perspective, it's not quite fit for purpose. Yeah.
That certainly seems to be the industry rhetoric coming through there was delay after delay, but there was a bit of optimism earlier in the year when deprecation of 1% did occur and it sort of got underway. But then there was, the CMA cited some competitive concerns to do with the sandbox. And it seems that the sandbox itself is the crux of the problem that might have caused the scrapping of the deprecation. But I think it's important now that we talk about what this means for the industry.
Yeah, so I think obviously we carry on as normal for now. I think brands and advertisers should expect or should be planning for a future without cookies at some point. But at the moment, it just means brands can kind of continue and advertisers can continue as we were in terms of targeting and their advertising from a third-party cookie perspective. But I think while people are celebrating that it's actually not going away, I think that in itself is probably sort of a false economy. We should be thinking about things slightly differently and planning to not have this heavy reliance on cookies because the data's not perfect, cookie data, and we're over-reliant on that data.
Yeah, so I suppose it says something about an organisation or a business if they are really celebrating this news because but third-party cookies, the devil's advocate to that is there'll be a lot of organisations that have said that's worked for them for a long time and they deal with the imperfections. So why do you think we should still be investing in cookie alternatives or first-party data solutions?
Yeah, so I think it's our job as a media agency to challenge that thought process. And we're so fixated as an industry at looking at the data that we have and not questioning the data that's missing. So we're using the best that we have in terms of the cookies and the data that gives us and the targeting that we can have. But is that best practice? And are we still putting the user at the forefront of everything that we should be doing as marketers? And I actually think that the cookie is probably partly responsible for creating a divide within marketing. Why have we got brand? Why have we got performance teams? It's like, well, the performance teams are using all the cookie data and the technical data, and we've kind of got a certain persona of the person that works in performance. And the marketing team are these creative guys and doing the brand campaigns and all that sort of thing. But I think that's created that divide and the silos that we see. And it's actually more prominent than you would imagine that brands still work in these silos of a brand and a performance teams. And I actually think, the cookies are part of the reason for that.
It's a really interesting point you raise, because there's been a lot of talk recently. I know in Cannes in June, this idea of brand formants kept popping up more and more. I know it's something I've talked about a lot on the podcast and in our coverage. And it seemed that there were two things that were bridging that gap and sort of breaking down those silos between lower funnel and upper funnel. And AI appears to be one of those things. But the other one was data and this investment in first-party data. So cookies hanging around, does it just bring those silos back?
It potentially in the short term, I think it will. It will keep the silos there. Whereas I think in a world where the cookies didn't exist, we'd be forced to work together, wouldn't we? We'd be forced to actually look at a more holistic view of marketing.
The data nerds and the creatives would have to come together.
Have to, yeah. We're a big believer that not enough people within an organisation have access to the MMM or a econometric model, whatever that might look like. So I think if you do give many teams visibility of that data, you will empower them to actually work together and say, hey, you might be seeing some trends over here because the cookie data has been lost, direct channels gone up, all of those sort of things you're experiencing. But when you're live with your activity, look what it does over here, and there's a correlation that we can make. And I think if you're working now within performance media and looking at the trends of the cookies being lost and CPAs maybe increasing and all of these things that are happening right now, kind of can be a bit of a, not a lonely place to work, but it's like, okay, this isn't fun for me to keep reporting data that is down from last year, down from the month before, because we're losing all of this information and this data.
And you brought up MMM then, marketing mix modeling, and there's a lot of alternatives to third-party cookies, and in particular when the deprecation was looming as something that was on the horizon. There was, we did an article, there were 25 plus alternatives to cookies, and you've raised a good one there in marketing mix modeling. Do you think that is the best way forward for brands and advertisers?
I do. I think it was always the answer, and it still is. Now I'm kind of old enough to have worked in media where tracking and cookies weren't a thing. I think when my first ever job, I only had, out of like the 10 odd clients that I had, only one was actually tracking revenue and all of these things. All the other advertisers coming from a print environment, moving to digital, and their mindset's completely different. It's like, well, I can guarantee I can only pay for the people that are clicking on my ad, or I know how many people are seeing my ad, rather than a print. They don't know if anybody's actually looking or reading at the ad. So that environment was very different. And then slowly, it's just become two completely different worlds, which I think is actually wrong. If we look at cookie data, or if we look at any attribution data that we're looking at right now, the data's always been missing massive amounts of information and data. But we've been fixated on what we can see. And like I said before, not questioning what's missing. So yeah, attribution's a really interesting one. We have TV's not in there, out of home, radio. Did the user read a review? Did their peer group help them? All of that, all those touch points are missing. But because we can see, they visited a paid social ad, then they came back and they did this, we think that's perfect, and that's the only data that we can see. But the truth is, we've always had holes in the data.
We probably need to be a bit more critical of the data we're collecting, and I think it's a really important, and that's ultimately what cookies always came down to, is they gave access to a lot of good, in quotes, data, but a lot of people just, it leaves an awful lot on the table. And you mentioned a couple of big mediums. Out of home, digital out of home has become a lot more measurable, particularly in the last few years. And you mentioned marketing mix modeling, and then there's identity solutions like the Trade Desk's EUID2, which has just come into the European market. So there's a lot of alternatives, but marketers are interesting, and brands and organizations, nobody loves change, and enforced change in particular is really difficult for a lot of people to contend with. So for those that are going to rest on their laurels and stay rooted within the third-party cookies that Chrome's going to continue to offer, can you postulate at all about what that might mean for them down the line? It's obviously a very short-term orientated strategy.
Yeah, well, long term, we don't know in terms of what choice Google's going to give the user. So there is a chance that it's not always going to be here. If Google do a good job in communicating what the third-party cookie is and giving the user an easy way to opt out of that, then we still might go down this route of a huge loss of data anyway. Something I was thinking about earlier, actually, if we were, you and I, to both pick up our phone and phone a friend of ours that doesn't work in our industry, would they even know what a cookie is And would they even know what a third party or first party cookie is? I'm going to say no.
Yeah, I'm going to agree, because I was canvassing friends throughout the last week or so,
Okay.
because I've had a lot of people, it was sort of a very stressful week last week. It was very busy on the coverage, and some friends of mine sort of pointed out, like, Joe, you've been super stressy this week. A lot's been going on. And I'm saying there was the biggest news story of the year came out. Chrome's not deprecating third-party cookie. No one has a clue, really. And we actually put out some data as the day of recording this morning, some data on the website to do with Americans. I think roughly 36% of Americans do not know what a cookie is at all, aside from, the sweet treat that everyone's aware of. But I think you're absolutely right. There's currently, when it comes to the users, there's a bit of a knowledge gap in terms of what third-party tracking is and third-party versus first-party data and what cookies sort of mean. And a lot of people blindly accept cookies. It's certainly a practice I used to do before I got into marketing coverage and began to understand a little bit more about my privacy. Do you think the user is one of the bigger losers from this news?
Yeah, yes and no. Because I don't know about yourself, but I actually use the targeting when I'm looking for new flooring at home, or I'm doing something, or I need something. I'll actively be using that to serve me some ads. Let me see what's out there. Let me have some choice. Let me do some research, and it's actually prompting me, and it's proactive. From that instance, I don't see there being a problem. There's been abuse of data for sure over the years. There are some obvious, really, really obvious ones. So lookalike targeting, really poor use of it, because you and I were both sports fans, so we could look like a very similar profile, but when it comes to buying and that real intent, we could be miles apart from that. So that side of it obviously is a problem. You've got remarketing, been a bit of a problem, and I think probably is one of the roots of all of these questions about cookies and what's happening with the data being followed around the internet. When you've been to a website, viewed a product, the standard stuff that we see. And I always when I speak to retailers, I always say, why do we do the things online we wouldn't dream of doing in real life or in person or on the high street? And I think that has damaged a lot of the trust that people have. And then the third thing is probably the first party data that brands are not even using. So there's still this over reliance on whether it's first party cookies or third party cookies to keep driving acquisition and get people in. We don't seem to be looking after the current customers. And by that I mean personalized communication, added value, long-term relationships with users. I'll share with you a very quick example. Last 2 years I've been playing paddle. I mentioned this actually at Unlocked. I bought a racket about 2 years ago. The sports brand I bought a racket from has sent me an email once every 2 days since I bought that racket. And they've not mentioned paddle once for 2 years. So I'm just getting a standard email that they send out. And I get it. They're a huge company. They send out 20 million emails twice a week. It's going to generate X amount of revenue, and that's what they care about.
But nothing is intended for you specifically.
Nothing. No. And I think brands are going to have to do a lot better. If we're going to lose some third-party data, we're going to find it harder to find people. There's going to be obvious things like YouTube, connected TV, sort of VOD, sorry. It's going to make, we still know about those users, don't we? We still know about the shows that they're watching. We still know, we've got information about them. But yeah, other channels, I think are going to suffer.
The consumers have been very clear with what they want, and it's privacy-orientated marketing.
Yeah.
But they're very open to personalization. So they've got no issues on the face when it comes to data collection, so long as it's controlled. They're aware of what is being collected and why. Yeah. And the subsequent ads that they are then served are useful. And as you said there, it takes quite a shrewd consumer to understand how they can manipulate their own third-party cookies to then maybe benefit from some advertising when they're dipping the toe in the water of getting into paddle or something else. Yeah. But I don't think that by and large across the board enough consumers know that that's something they can do, and they are left a little bit powerless. So I think it's a hit on the personalization front for sure.
Yeah. I think it's definitely pre and post environment, pre-post purchasing, right? Pre, everyone's freaked out by that, or say everyone, the people that don't really understand what's happening, they do think that my data is being captured.
It can feel a bit intrusive.
Exactly. Instead of understanding I'm just ID 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and they don't really know anything about me. But I think collectively we can do a lot better in terms of our targeting and personalization, our messaging, that it doesn't feel quite as intrusive. Just because the data allows us and the technology allows us to do the things that we do, is that the right thing for the user? And I'll put myself out there and say no. We've done things, and I say I'm part of the problem, right? So it's the industry I work in. But we've done things because the technology allows us to, rather than thinking, hey, just because they visited a homepage, why have I just remarketed them for like the last month or so? I've got a good friend who works in retail, and I said to him, imagine a shop assistant following you out of the store. I mean, it's just bizarre, isn't it? But we do it online because the technology allows us to, but no one's just stopped for a minute. Is this okay? And good use of the cookie data that we have. So we kind of brought it on ourselves, I'd say.
Well, and brand trust is just critically important, and it's really, really difficult to build, and you can lose it in the snap of a finger.
Yeah.
So it's very easy to lose, very difficult to gain. And I think for those particularly who maybe are celebrating this news more than some others, it's a reflection that the priorities are misplaced, because it's going to hurt brand trust if you're going to sit within the third-party cookie and use that, because it's your Padel example is perfect. You went out there, bought a racket, got interested in this new sport, and that brand has then had an opportunity to personalize their offerings to you. And who knows, maybe you could be a pro Padel player had they gotten that right.
Yep.
But you're left with poor advertising that isn't just for you. It's just getting sent out to everybody.
Yeah.
And I mean, I imagine the relationship with that brand, it's not as good of a sort of two-way conversation as it could be.
No, I think something I thought of as well. So reading a lot of the comments about obviously what we're talking about here, the deprecation of cookies, a lot of people are kind of saying, is there now a sort of an emphasis on first-party data collection? Now, yes, obviously that should always be the case, shouldn't it?
Yeah.
But then what are you doing with that data if you're not going to personalize the information, the communication?
It's one thing to collect the first-party data. It's another thing to use it.
Exactly. Not every, but on a lot of retail websites, the first thing you get hit within 20 seconds is a pop-up, 10% off your first order, subscribe now. It's data collection, great. But what do you do with that data afterwards is a big thing. It is strange. I find it strange because we know that retention is cheaper than acquisition, but we still leave a lot of that on the table. It's slightly odd. And I think that what else is odd is, why don't brands, kind of going a little bit off topic, so we're moving into first-party data, but why are brands not engaging in two-way communication? They got my data, could have asked me, are you a beginner? Are you an intermediate? Are you an advanced? Now, everyone might say they're advanced because everyone thinks they are. They could have then said, hey, how many times a week do you play?
Yeah.
And then
they can break it down and find out for themselves.
Again, not ever going to be perfect, but there's going to be some assumptions that you can make within that user. I don't know if you remember a couple of years ago, it's all over LinkedIn that brands started sending sensitive emails around Mother's Day and Father's Day, saying, look, if it's a sensitive period, we'll take you out of that email distribution.
Yeah, I see.
Everyone was going crazy about that on LinkedIn. Like, this is great. They're showing that they understand, and I'm like, that's really basic though, isn't it? That we've waited till now to be able to do those sort of
Shouldn't
things.
Have been such a big.
Shouldn't
have had the industry as a buzz as maybe it was. But I think, and to your points, what it reflects is perhaps this moment is a real opportunity for these brands and organizations that are going to not celebrate this news. They're going to look at it and go, look, I think this is a really good chance to get even further ahead of the curve.
Yeah.
Because a lot of organizations are going to rest on their laurels and aren't going to move with any urgency to change their practices. But those that do, when they invest in first-party data and better targeting and ultimately personalization to build that brand trust with consumers who need to be top of mind constantly, and they're not anywhere near enough, having covered this industry for 2 years now, they're often the first thing to be neglected. So it's a real opportunity for brands. Now, Mike, I want to pivot towards something that we raised briefly, but it's this idea that Google have said they're going to introduce, in lieu of deprecation, a user choice option when it comes to cookies. And What do you think that means? Because we haven't really got much follow-up on what it was.
No.
So it's totally postulating between the two of us, but you're certainly better placed to comment than me.
Yeah, I suppose I started thinking about the Apple environment and Safari, and I don't remember ever being prompted about that. It was just kind of done. And you've got to kind of go into your settings to kind of change that. I think Google's going to be a bit more proactive, and reading between the lines and a lot of comments, I think a lot of the industry thinks that they're going to word it in a way that it's just going to be a really quick accept thing to continue as it is. And then, like with Apple, got to go into your settings to reverse that. People just are not going to do that. So it's going to be really key on that first notification at the browser level, how, depending on how they communicate it. If we're thinking about the money, Google wants to keep people the cookies enabled, right? And wants users to accept that. So I'd imagine they do it in a way that makes it really fast and easy for people to accept that.
I wonder if, I doubt they will, but there was an interesting bit of news that came out last week on the cookie front. The Mail, the Mirror, the Express and the Independent, a couple of big national publishers, rolled out a consent or paywall, which was basically, if you want a cookieless experience, you're going to have to be charged between, it was £2 and £4 monthly for cookieless access to the sites. If you wanted to remain free access to the sites, then you had to accept cookies. Do you think maybe this is a practice we're going to start to see a little bit more?
I wouldn't expect that from Google, purely because it's not the content play that those publishers have, right? There's the value exchange.
No, certainly not Google, but it's a really interesting maneuver, isn't it?
If you've got value and you've got content that there is that exchange for it, it's like we're used to now paying for not having ads, right? And that happens quite a lot. I'm not sure whether that will become the mainstream.
Well, the rise of
ad blockers and
but the rise of it's really interesting in the streaming space this front, because the rise of free advertising, fast streaming really shows that I think people are less inclined to sort of pay a premium to get an ad-free experience. I think they're more inclined to just deal with ads if they do get access to the content and have it for free. And it's definitely a different story in publishing, and streaming's a different sort of channel altogether. But I guess on the cookieless front, there's less of that content play. But Google's really interesting because they've turned away from deprecating third-party cookies, but the last 6 months has been a real revamp of Google Meridian, which is their marketing mix modeling solution. So they're across all different fronts, and first-party data is certainly something that they are invested and interested in.
Yeah.
So it just makes me think that perhaps this was all to do with the sandbox not quite being fit for purpose, and maybe there wasn't an agreement that they were able to come to with the CMA.
Yeah. So I definitely agree that it's not fit for purpose or not ready. Meridian's a really good point that you raised there, because even though Google is 90+% in terms of the browser for Chrome in the UK, Google in analytics will notice that they're losing or seeing that data, right? So Apple users, in-app, all of that sort of information is being lost anyway. So I think moving into Meridian just is plugging that gap, right? We know you're losing half of your data. Potentially, we've got clients that have over 50% of users don't consent to the cookies. So taking their Google hat off, which they don't do a lot, but they seem to have to do now, right? So I think that play is moving because of the loss of the data anyway. But interested on the payment side. I don't think Google will go down that route. Although I am very close to paying for YouTube again, because the ads are just too much.
Oh, well, there you go.
As a user. So maybe over time, but again, that's because I want the content, and I do want it ad-free. I don't want interruptions. But
Google have played around with the idea of a pay-to-play model. There have been rumours circulating that you have to, for their AI tools, you're going to have to pay. And I'd have to check, but I believe some of their AI tools, like Gemini, you already have to pay to get sort of a premium service option. That could be wrong. There's certainly been rumours about that happening. So I know on the generative AI front, when it comes to Google Gemini, they are experimenting with the idea of a pay-to-play sort of model. But certainly when it comes to Chrome as a browser and the search offering, it would be a bit of a pivot. But it's certainly not something I'd rule out altogether. Mike, is there anything else you wanted to touch on the cookie front before we move to PMW's famous Resell Me a Pen challenge?
Have we touched on it because we've spoken before about the cookies actually being to the detriment of marketers?
I think we did briefly,
touch
but I
it.
think we
Okay.
can elaborate a little bit more, because I know that's a point that you
Yeah.
really believe, that you really, really believe in.
Yeah, I think that has created the silos.
Yeah.
And we do need to break those. And you kind of mentioned about change, and change has to come from the top down. For teams to want to work together, to collaborate more, to understand they're going to lose data, or they're losing data. So I need a broader picture. When we go to events like yours, I always ask the audience who has access to an MMM. Very few people put their hand up. So whoever owns that MMM is still keeping it kind of closed in the marketing team, or whoever it is that owns that. I think that marketers don't ask questions about the data that they have, first party data. Normally the data controllers are not asking the questions about marketing and what's going on there. So I think, there's a huge opportunity for the whole industry to remove the reliance of cookies and get working together and back to the good old days, shall we say.
The good old days. Yeah. I mean, I think I'm glad you've re-emphasized that point, because it does just come back to there should be this onus to break down the silos, get lower funnel, moving up the funnel, mid funnel, upper funnel, have it all working together, get creatives and the data-driven performance heads to work together, because I think when people were pushed to do that, more often than not, it drove success on a marketing front.
There was something that just popped into my mind, and I'd like to get your take actually. Why is it that the digital channels are under such scrutiny from a measurement perspective compared to like offline channels? I know digital out of home is improved, and we can do a lot more programmatic, dynamic ads and stuff like that. But no one questions TV, radio, in the same way that the digital channels are. So because we've had a little bit of cookie data telling us what's going on in digital, we kind of lose that and everyone's really scared. But over here, you've had these mass media, probably the biggest lines in your media plan, and doesn't have the same scrutiny. For me, that, again, just doesn't make any sense.
I think it comes down to, as you're talking about these silos, and there is a bit of an imbalance on anything on an advertising front that's sort of driven by performance and data, because that's what performance marketing in essence is, data-driven results. You can see the results for your marketing, whereas the other channels, in particular, those that aren't digital, they tend to be a little bit more creative orientated when it comes to campaigns. And I just think that there's anything that's a bit of a brand building strategy gets a little bit of a pass, or has historically sometimes gotten a little bit of a pass, because we say, well, what are the right metrics? We don't really need to make sure this is it's not always a revenue driving exercise. Maybe it's more of an awareness exercise. There's a lot of organizations that are still working on new metrics, but it's certainly one that I just think and there maybe won't ever be the same scrutiny that data-driven performance marketers face on the digital front when it comes to things that are a bit more brand and creative orientated.
Yeah, and I think that is a problem. I'm going to give a shout out to Jenna, who's heads up our media department, and she coined this phrase, and it's perfect. All media is performance media. It might be a brand exercise, it might be sentiment, it might be something else, but it still needs to perform in raising your brand awareness. It still needs to perform to have higher brand recall. That everything we do has to perform. The KPIs are different, but no one wants to run a TV ad that doesn't work. So it still has to perform. So I think, bringing those lines together, it has to be done sooner rather than later.
And eliminating third-party cookies is a good way to go. Whether that
would
be forced upon you by Chrome or otherwise.
That would have forced everyone to kind of behave differently. I mean, we're already kind of behaving differently because of the loss of data through Apple and social media anyway. Google, it would have been nice for Google just to continue that way, and then we definitely would have rounded that off. But
all media is performance media. That's what we like to hear on the Performance Marketing Unlocked podcast, mate. That's a real hot take, and maybe it's one that not enough people are ready to hear. We are almost out of time. As much as I'm loving the cookie discussion, we're going to have to pivot into the Resell Me a Pen challenge. Now, would you like to reveal what it is you're going to resell to me, what outdated product or service?
It's the Yellow Pages, the physical Yellow Pages.
The physical Yellow Pages.
And I'll explain why. So, very briefly, DAC's over 50 years old. So, as you can imagine, in the 70s, we were a print-based media company. directory is a big part of that. We've pivoted to digital, but location is really key part of our offering. But why? I'll do the sell of Yellow Pages. So right now, if you're looking for us,
if we're going to jump in, I'll put you on the
time.
clock, Mike.
Okay.
We've got 60 seconds.
There we go.
I won't wipe off 3 for jumping ahead of it. I will stick with it. But yeah, Mike, 60 seconds to resell me the physical Yellow Pages. I'll give you the warning at 10 seconds and 5 seconds to go. But jump in now.
Okay, so if you were to search now for a service plus location, you're going to get a digital result owned by a digital team, even though it's a retail asset. So sometimes you'll get mixed signals. You'll be pointed to the website. They want you to do something e-commerce. The Yellow Pages, if you need a service here and now, urgently, you're going to speak to someone, whereas you find a phone number online, chances are they don't even answer the phone. So you speak to a business owner, someone's going to help you, and somebody's local to you.
And are we done?
Yeah, quick.
Amazing. That's the quickest one we've had there. I was sure that's 30 seconds down pat.
I could have added that it keeps doors open and these things that we used back in the day when you saw the Yellow Pages book around the house. But yeah, that's
you said what you needed to say. No, short,
go.
Concise, sharp pitch, very old school, Mike. I loved hearing about it. The Yellow Pages is a real interesting one because it's something that me personally was totally missed. Just didn't exist in my working life at all. But it's one that I know my parents had. I know a lot of, so the older heads around the office will know exactly what you're talking about. But anything that gets you indirect contact with a business, cutting out that sort of middleman or having to go through something online or, God forbid, an AI chatbot that doesn't work very well, it definitely cuts out the crap and goes right to where you want to. And I think that's the big selling point, isn't it?
Yeah, and we see it a lot. So even from an online journey or an online experience, you're telling Google via your search that you want a location and you want a service. But again, because of the silos, it's an e-com or digital team that manages that, they point you to the website. Hey, you can still buy online or you can still do something online, but I told you I wanted a location. So is that, again, that's another fight between e-com and retail.
Yeah, I mean, hey, maybe we all got to go back to the Yellow Pages. Maybe that's
I won't go that far. Maybe just do the digital better.
Maybe that's the way forward. Or maybe it is, as you say, doing the digital better. Mike, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on the show today.
Thanks
I hope you enjoyed your first podcast as much as I enjoyed having you on the show.
I'll tell you when I watch it back.
We appreciate your time. Thanks very much for coming in.
Thanks for having me.
And that concludes this episode of the Performance Marketing Unlocked podcast. A big thank you to my editorial colleagues Jyoti and Reem for joining me at the beginning of the show to discuss the biggest and winners and losers from this Google third-party cookie deprecation news. And of course, a big thank you to Mike Fantis, the Vice President and Managing Partner of DAC Group UK, for giving us some really honest and open and candid insights into what he thinks this news means for the broader industry, not just in terms of third-party cookies, but crucially in terms of first-party data and data as a commodity going forward. I liked that we discussed implications for the users and for consumers there too, because I think brand trust is something that really stands to be impacted by this third-party cookie deprecation news. And I think when it comes to privacy, personalization, those are two big things that users have really sent a message to the industry demanding. And this is a bit of a crossroads for brands and organization as to whether or not they're going to try and meet those expectations of consumers. It will be really interesting to see how things move forward in the coming weeks, months, and even years. So a big thank you to Mike for such an insightful discussion. But of course, as always, I'd be remiss if I didn't thank you, the loyal listener, for tuning in each and every fortnight as you do, and for, on this occasion, putting up with my very, very raspy voice. Let's hope things are sorted out a little bit more and I get on the mend ahead of the next episode of the show. Don't forget, if you haven't already, please subscribe to the show on your podcast platform of choice. And if you're so inclined, leave us a positive rating and review. Those go an awful long way towards making sure we can keep doing the show that you all love. In the meantime, have an amazing week, and we'll be back very shortly with another episode of the Performance Marketing Unlocked podcast. Bye for now.